In this video, I'll be ranking every single study method I've ever used as a student, and we'll see which is the best of the best. Hey guys, my name's Luis and I'm a medical student from the Philippines. So I'll be ranking these study techniques based on the efficiency and effectiveness of them in preparing for exams. So given that, my experiences using these techniques may be different from yours, so take that in mind as we go through them throughout this video. I'll be placing these study methods into one of 5 categories. There's the big brain, which are the study techniques that are so good and will probably get you into the top percentile of your class if you apply them. There's excellent, which will at the very least get you above average in your class. There's good, which are techniques that will help you understand the lessons better, but not necessarily help you perform better on exams. There's average, which are study techniques that may or may not be helpful depending on the context and situation they're used in. And then there's meh, which are those study methods that I find are not particularly helpful and you're probably better off using different ones instead. Now the first method I'm going to cover is active recall. Now if you know me, I'm a huge opponent of active recall. Ever since I learned it from Ali Abdal back in my first year of medical school, it's become a huge portion of how I study anything in medical school. And scientifically, it's the single most efficient way to learn anything. And basically, active recall is testing yourself, where you try to test yourself and see if you actually remember the information you just tried to study. And because of that, I consider it a big brain study method, and it's a method that I think everyone should employ in their study routines. And it's because of the efficiency of the study method that I don't have to study so many hours during the school year, still maintain decent grades, and have time to make these YouTube videos. So the next study method that I'll cover is the Pomodoro method. So the Pomodoro method is a popular study method used by a lot of students all around the world. And basically, it's just 25 minutes of work followed by 5 minutes of rest. And you repeat those intervals around 4 times before giving yourself one big long break. And personally, I don't find the standard work-rest interval to be quite that good. Because when you're studying something as complex as medicine, you really need more time to really sit down and try to understand the concepts. But I do find it's a good warm-up method when you're just trying to ease your way into studying when you're just starting out. But as you go along, I recommend that you slowly increase your work interval to around 50 minutes of work with 10 minutes of rest. So based on how I use it, I would rate it as good. The next study method now is note-taking. So note-taking for me is a method that I find is very hit or miss depending on the context that you use. I find that if you're a really good note-taker, you take really good notes and that's basically all you need to do very well in exams. But if you're not a very good note-taker, note-taking can actually be a detriment because it'll still be lacking and you'll end up wasting your time trying to use it as a primary resource. Like in my experience, I used to take a lot of notes in college for a lot of my classes because we didn't really have handouts and our profs didn't really give us the lecture slides. So I was really forced to take down notes. But when I got to med school, the pace of information was just too great that note-taking wasn't really that helpful as an individual. And since they were giving us handouts already then, it was just better just to rely on the handouts rather than just rely on my own notes. Because in the long run, the amount of information that I get in these handouts would be much greater than relying purely on my own notes. The problem also with note-taking is that I find that some people get the idea that they're actually being productive just when the very act of taking notes, when in fact that just because you're taking down notes doesn't mean the information is staying in your brain, and you still have to make extra effort to create the memory cues in order to retrieve that information properly. So because of the context-related effectiveness of the method, I would rate it as average. So the next study method I'll be going over is rereading your notes or the text. Now, I'm pretty sure this is a common method that a lot of us use growing up in school, in high school, and in college, where you just reread our notes or just reread the textbook that was given to us in order to prepare for the exam. And as we go over the text, it's like, oh, this is familiar, so we feel that we actually know the content, and then come actual exam, it's like we don't actually know the answers. And because of this, I find that rereading your notes or the text is not very effective because it's a very passive way of learning. And if you rely on this method, especially if you're a med student or in anything that requires you to learn a lot of information, you're not going to do very well in exams. And because of that, I put it as meh. So the next study method I'll be talking about is spaced repetition. And for those who don't know, spaced repetition is basically spacing out reviews in such a way that you stop the exponential decay of your memory over time. And the whole point of spaced repetition is that you time your reviews in such a way that you're just about to reach that cusp where you're about to forget a significant amount of information, and then you stop it by resetting the information decay. And the beautiful thing about this is that with spaced repetition, for every review you do, you slow down the rate at which you forget by a significant amount. So as you do it, it takes much longer for you to forget a significant amount of information. And paired with active recall, this creates very strong neural connections in your head to remember information for longer. And because of that, I put this as a big brain study method. Now next is going through someone else's note or reading pre-made reviewers. Now whether it's reading your own notes, someone else's notes, or notes that you found online, the quality of these are all dependent on the person who made them. In my school, and a lot of med schools here in the Philippines, we have something what's called a transcription system. The batch as a whole makes transcripts of the lecture and has a system in place to fact check these so that the notes generated are as accurate as possible. And for me, this saves a lot in the initial studying process, because the information there will be mostly complete and for the most part will be factually accurate. The downside though of this method is that you're reliant on how the person who made these notes interpreted the original lesson. So unless the set of notes was fact-checked over and over again or made by someone who's really competent, you'll never be really sure if all the information there is correct. And on top of that, it's still a set of notes, so it's still a relatively passive way to learn if you're just gonna read it. But it at least saves you time in the initial studying process, and because of that, I'll still rate it as good. So the next studying method I'll be going over is rewatching the lectures or going over the slides again. And I find this is a very meh method because I find it's a very passive way to learn the material, because in your initial pass, you should have made the effort already to try to learn the first basic principles of the lesson. And usually going over it again, unless there are key points of information that you forgot to include in your initial set of notes, is a very passive way to learn the material. The next study method I'll be talking about is flashcards. And if you know me, I'm a huge Anki advocate and just using flashcards in general. But that doesn't mean I don't acknowledge the shortcomings it has as a method. For preparing for exams that have a lot of discrete facts such as anatomy and pharmacology, flashcards come in very useful because it really drills in those specific pieces of information that will definitely come out during the exam. And using apps like Anki is especially helpful because there's an integrated spaced repetition feature which will space out your reviews over time, so it will further optimize your learning. However, where this method overall falls short is that it's not particularly useful in learning the first basic principle. So we get a pre-made deck for Anki and you just start reviewing the cards right off the bat. You don't have the context for those cards, so you don't understand the broader picture as a whole, and you're just looking at the minute details immediately. And that's not particularly helpful for helping you understand the greater picture that these minute details are a part of. And also, it doesn't really prepare you for the real world scenarios, since flashcards are pretty black and white, it's either this or that, and really doesn't prepare for those gray areas in the real world. But as a method for preparing for exams, I'd still consider it an excellent study method. Now the next method that I'll discuss are mind maps. Now, mind maps are something that are particularly helpful, especially if you're a visual spatial learner, because they help you visualize pieces of information within your head. So what I remember when I was studying OB-GYN back in first year, I created a mind map for the phases of labor. Within that, I would map out what are the specific events that were occurring within each phase, so that when I went back to recall, I could visualize where along that mind map specific events were occurring. So come exam time, if they gave a scenario, I could recognize based on the key events occurring which phase it was, because I could go back and visualize in my head, it is in this part of this page because I colored it green or something like that. And since you're mapping it out on paper or digitally, it's creating these categories in your head so that it can compartmentalize those pieces of information. And that applies the principle of chunking, which allows you to memorize more information by grouping pieces of information into distinct chunks, which will act as their own unit of memory. And overall, that helps you understand bigger picture concepts when you're initially studying a specific lesson. But where it falls short is that it's not particularly helpful when you're trying to learn specific bits of information where flashcards are a better method to use. But overall, I still find it as a good study method. Now it's said that the highest form of mastery is the ability to apply one's knowledge, and second to that is the ability to teach that knowledge to others. And this is basically what Definement technique is, where you take complex topics and try to distill it down to its simplest terms, remove as much jargon as possible, and still teach the core principles of that knowledge to someone who has absolutely no background in the information you're trying to share with them. So for example, this video is my application of the Definement technique because I'm trying to explain these concepts to you without much jargon so that you, the viewer, can understand them. And because of that, I rate this study method as excellent. And beyond just exams, I find that applying the Definement technique is important in any profession, especially in that of medicine, because in this profession, we're interacting with a lot of people who don't have background in this type of science. So being able to explain it in the most basic terms to lay people is really helpful in this profession, and hopefully will lead to better patient outcomes. Now, it is my belief when preparing for a written exam, the single most effective way to prepare for them is to do as many practice exams as possible. Because you want to simulate the actual thing that you're preparing for as many times so you get used to it, especially in the types of questions and then the scenario and the time pressure that you'll be under. And doing mock exams can come in the form of past papers from your school, or online question banks that you found online, or practice questions that you make yourself. What matters is that they try to simulate as close as possible to that real thing. It's important to know that when doing this method is that you don't fall into the trap of just memorizing the correct answers when you get a question wrong. Try to understand why you got them wrong so that you fill in the gaps in your knowledge so that you don't repeat the same mistake. And the same goes for items that you got right but you just got them right because you guessed it. So for mock exams, I would rate this study method as an excellent study method. So the next study method I'll be talking about is rote learning. So rote learning is basically a fancy way of saying memorizing. And there are many ways to do memorizing. There are many techniques out there, mnemonics, acronyms, chunking, etc. And the nice thing about this is that it really helps you memorize those minute details of information that often comes out in exams. But the downside of it is that although you know like every single Krebs cycle related disease, you don't really know the principles of why those diseases happen. So like the flashcard method, it suffers from the same weakness of not being able to really teach people the basic principles very well. And it's better supplemented with techniques such as active recall and spaced repetition. So then because of that, I can only rate it as a good study method. So the next study method I'll be talking about is group study. And one thing I really like about group study is that it gives you someone to hold you accountable whether your group study is online or in person. But the thing about it is that its effectiveness depends on the type of person you are. If you're the type of person who easily gets distracted studying out or being around other people, you're probably not gonna find this method very useful that often. But what I do find useful about the study method is that, especially if you're studying for exams that are oral in nature or are return demos, it's very good to have people provide you feedback real time so that you can fill in the gaps that you otherwise wouldn't notice if you're just doing it by yourself. And another downside is that it's reliant on syncing up schedules with the people that you're studying with, so it's not a consistent technique. And because of that, I will only rate it as a good study method. And last but not the least, watching online videos. Now, online videos are something I think many of us have done in the past, where we go onto YouTube and search up a video on a topic we don't understand, or just in general use Google to answer questions that we don't easily find in our notes or in our reference textbook. And I find that online videos are particularly helpful for lectures that aren't very well done or the professor failed to explain a certain topic well. And I find that there are plenty of YouTube channels out there such as Ninja Nerd Science or Osmosis that explain complex topics very well in a very dumbed down manner that most students will easily pick up on the key principles needed to master the topic. However, this study method is still relatively passive since you're just listening to the video for the most part and not necessarily actively learning the information. So I would only rate this method as good. So I hope you found the ranking of the different study techniques that I've been using over the years useful. And if you want to learn more of the study techniques that I'm currently using, check out this playlist here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.